In the fall of 1973, Yoko Ono turned to John Lennon and said, "Look, John, it's starting to feel like we're not passionate with each other. Are we just going to be one of those old conservative couples who are together just because we're married?" And like that, they both agreed it would do their marriage no harm if John found other sexual partners. Well, I bet you've never heard this story before. Hit like and subscribe and let's get going. Apart from one drunken lapse at Jerry Rubin's place, John had actually never been unfaithful to Yoko and had no idea how to go about it, even with her say so. And he felt uncomfortable doing it under her nose in New York too. So off he went to Los Angeles. John left with a suitcase, $10,000 in traveller's checks and a woman who wasn't his wife. So enter May Pang, a 22-year-old Chinese American who worked as an assistant to John and Yoko. Yoko had instructed with her to go to John to Los Angeles and do whatever he wanted to do. She was uncomfortable being his mistress at first as it went against her Catholic beliefs. However, this was John Lennon, and you didn't say no to Yoko Ono. Now begins what would famously become known as his Lost Weekend, which is a period of emotional chaos, creative peaks, drunken brawls, and a constant yearning for home. On September the 18th, 1973, John and May flew to LA. May thought it would just be a 2-week trip. Well, it wasn't. John referred to these 18 months as his lost weekend because of the 1945 film. The film follows a young writer, played by Ray Milland, as he struggles through a solitary Friday to Monday in New York, wrestling with demons of temptation and self-loathing. From the moment they landed, the separation felt more permanent than agreed. Elliot Mintz, who was Lennon's close friend and PR rep, revealed that he said she'd kicked him out and he didn't know when or even if they'd be getting back together. Mintz's retelling of these days is a huge source for this video. So Lennon's life in LA became a volatile mix of bachelorism and emotional collapse. It was completely different to his activism days in New York. John and May stayed in a duplex in West Hollywood, loaned by lawyer Harold Cedar, who was representing him against Alan Klein. They then moved to Lou Adler's Bel Air home at the insistence of ex-Rolling Stones manager Andrew Loog Oldham. Ringo Starr popped in often. He was sort of enjoying a bit of a bachelor life of his own. Despite the unresolved legal questions among them, the other 3 ex-Beatles could still put aside their differences in mutual fondness for Ringo. On Ringo's new album, John had actually written a song, "I'm the Greatest," and sung harmonies, and George had played lead guitar, and another song called 6 O'Clock featured Paul and Linda McCartney. Ringo had also bought John Lennon's old home in England, Tittenhurst Park, and John felt a lot better selling it to an old pal so that it wasn't gone forever, and Ringo assured him that there would always be a bedroom there for him. From the moment John Lennon reached LA, according to Elliot Mintz, his one thought was returning back to Yoko. He said, called her every day, saying, "When can I come home?" She'd also call me every day to see how he was doing and check that he wasn't harming himself or making a fool of himself. Though at that stage, she certainly wasn't looking to get back with him. Most of the time, John was in denial. But when he got drunk or high, he couldn't stop talking about Yoko and how much he needed her. The sense with him all the time was, what do I have to do to get out of here and get back to her? May Pang, who was caught in the middle, never quite became his rock star girlfriend. One day she'd be his lover, the next just his assistant. As she later admitted, it always felt like Yoko was watching and directing from afar. It wasn't like he left his wife for his mistress, said photographer Bob Gruen. He left his wife for wild times that his secretary oversaw. May talks about that period as if it was her time with John, but there are dozens of other women who can dispute that. It's fascinating to me that in all these years, not one of them has come forward or tried to cash in on their story. I tend to think that they treasure that hour, that 10 minutes or that night with John Lennon, and they have that memory, and it's private. Despite all of this, the threat of deportation always loomed over John's head. He had to make periodic trips back to New York to consult with his lawyer Leon Wilds, or appear before the Immigration and Naturalization Service. During his time in Los Angeles, John came to rely heavily on Mintz, who not only had entry everywhere as an ABC show business reporter, but also shared his love of words and awareness of subjects that are outside rock and roll. One night, Mintz took him backstage at the Roxy Theatre to meet his great teenage rock and roll idol, Jerry Lee Lewis, well, after Elvis. Instead of shaking hands, John fell on all fours and began kissing Lewis's cowboy boots. Now, son, the idol said. That ain't necessary at all. There was a weekend trip to Las Vegas where John devised an infallible system to win at roulette, basically just betting a $10 chip on almost every number on the wheel. Within minutes, he attracted the crowd that the casino's highest rollers couldn't pull. He also made Mintz go with him to see Deep Throat, which was at that time probably the most explicit erotic movie ever shown in mainstream cinemas. In October of 1973, John settled a copyright infringement case out of court after being accused of borrowing lyrics and melody from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me in his song Come Together. Just give it a bit of a listen and decide for yourself.
On a flat top, he was moving up with me, then come waving goodbye in a little old souped up jitney. I put,
here come old flat top, he come grooving up slowly, got juju eyeball.
As part of the settlement, he agreed to record 3 songs owned by music publisher Morris Levy, including You Can't Catch Me, ensuring that Levy would receive royalties from their release. John felt that just recording 3 songs didn't feel right, so he wanted to make a full album of his favourite songs that he grew up on. The rock and roll classics that inspired him to become a musician in the first place. He teamed up with Phil Spector to record the nostalgic covers album, which they referred to in the studio as Oldies and Moldies. After producing 2 albums with the Plastic Ono Band, Spector played it simple, especially when John offered him full creative control, desiring only to be a singer in a band. Time was booked at A&M Studios and top session musicians were recruited, including Leon Russell, guitarist Steve Cropper and Jesse Davis, and John's favourite post-Beatles drummer, Jim Keltner. Sessions began in mid-October of 1973. The sessions were chaotic. John was drinking more than he ever had in his life. He'd truly been let off the leash, no longer responsible for anything anymore. Back in the Beatles days, he'd always had Cynthia or Yoko or Julian to think about. He hit the bottle like he was 18 years old. However, alcohol would change his personality from the sort of cheeky charmer to often a trouble seeker and could be violent drunk. When we were out and about together and John was in that state, it used to be quite pitiful if a fan came, spotted him and came over for an autograph, Elliot Mintz remembers. This was the Beatle who had made us all think, the John Lennon who had lifted us onto a higher plane of consciousness with his lyrics, who was always so witty. And here he is, spilling a drink on his pants and not able to form a coherent sentence. The look of letdown on people's faces was terrible. John now drank in the studio, something that he'd never done as a Beatle. Sure, he'd been high a lot, but he'd sit with his headphones on, and at his feet now would be a huge bottle of Smirnoff vodka. His life was spiralling. Once, after a drunken meltdown over Yoko, Jesse, Ed Davis and Jim Keltner had to physically restrain him with neckties. May fled the house to the nearby Beverly Hotel. John smashed furniture, platinum records, and even uprooted a palm tree. There were 2 occasions when I suffered physical abuse from John. On one of them, he grabbed me by the throat so hard I thought he seriously meant to throttle me. A couple of other times, I was the victim of his verbal hatchets. And there were plenty of days when he was just low-level, surly and mean. But against that, I have to set 200 or 300 instances of his selflessness, kindness, generosity and affection. The chaotic nature of the studio sessions didn't help anything. So one night, to emphasise that Phil Spector would not cope with any arguments, he drew his pistol and fired it into the air. Jim Keltner, who had actually just gone out for a soda, returned to find Mal Evans standing on a metal cabinet and trying to pry the bullet from the ceiling. Listen Phil, if you're gonna kill me, but don't with me ears. I need him. The silver lining throughout this period was John's rekindling with his son Julian. Julian was now 11. He'd not seen his father for more than 2 years, and in all that time they'd only spoken a handful of times on the phone. Life after John had been cruel to Cynthia. Her marriage to Roberto Bassini had ended in divorce and she'd returned back to England, taking a small house and trying to make a career as an interior designer. Reading about John's separation from Yoko, she wondered if it might help improve his relationships with Julian and herself. In February 1974, she was invited to join a group of friends crossing to New York. Nervously, she contacted John and asked if she could bring Julian over to see him. To her surprise, he not only welcomed the idea, but offered to provide first-class tickets. Also on board was Elton John, who went out of his way to be charming to Cynthia and invited Julian to see his collection of enormous glasses. May Pang also helped to lighten the moment, having been Julian's occasional playmate at Tottenhurst Park. May found John's first wife a lot easier to like than his second. The reunion passed off so well that John offered to take Julian back to Los Angeles for a holiday while Cynthia stayed in New York with her old friend Jenny Boyd. When this arrangement fell through, he invited her to join the expedition to LA. On the flight, however, though, he made sure her seat was at the rear of the cabin, as far away from possible as John's, May's and Julian's. In the privacy of a remote seat, she burst into tears. May continued to be vital to managing John's relationship with his former family throughout that holiday. She told John he should book Cynthia a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel rather than boarding her out with his drummer. She'd even planned that they should spend a day together at Disneyland. Julian refused to go without his mother and grew so tearful that John had no choice but to relent. Cynthia therefore spent an uncomfortable amount of hours trailing around the rides with May and Mal Evans, aware of John's constant fear that they may lag behind the others and have to make conversation. The holiday ended on a successful note, with John taking Julian to Disneyland twice more and, at May's insistence, promising to phone him twice a week from now on. Around this time, a radio interviewer asked John if there was anything about his life that he'd change if he had the chance. Elliot Mintz remembers. John said there was nothing. Then he paused, thought for a little, and finally said that if he had his time over, he'd be different to Julian. He realised he should have been there more for him, but as he once said to me, some of us just can't handle that, and I think when he realised it, a part of himself was able to forgive his own father, who hadn't been there for him. John always kept an interest in the world's events during his time in Los Angeles. He read the New York Times from cover to cover each day and waited impatiently for CBS's evening news fronted by Walter Cronkite. Besides missing Yoko, he clearly missed England enormously. If no British person happened to be in town, the next best thing was Sharon Lawrence, who was an England-obsessed journalist turned PR rep who had lived in London and been friend to a load of rock stars, including Jimi Hendrix. She was now running the West Coast arm of Elton John's Rocket label. In her office was a love seat where John would curl up and talk for hours about things that, Americans wouldn't understand. Things like music hall, wireless soap operas, and Royal Worcester china. Sharon said, "He told me I'm always going to look after Ringo and make sure he wants for nothing as long as he lives." I'd never thought John was big-headed, but I was sometimes amazed at his lack of confidence in himself. More than once, he sat there and asked me, "Do you ever think I'll have a hit record again?" Despite spending a long time there, John didn't come to love Los Angeles like New York. There was just too much missing for him. The people he was associating with didn't think of anything outside of music and getting high, and they never read anything more intellectually demanding than the Rolling Stone. And the main thing was he didn't meet any woman out in Los Angeles that could hold a candle to Yoko. He still spoke to Yoko on the phone constantly. May Pang once said that she counted 23 phone calls in one day. John kept asking to come home, and Yoko kept saying he wasn't ready. On trips back to New York, he would often call at the Dakota. Once, when she was in Philadelphia, he returned to their apartment, found a new vase in her bedroom, and because he assumed it was a gift from another man, smashed it to pieces and disappeared. And then Yoko's first act when she returned home was to change the locks. Meanwhile, Crisis had 8 Oldies and Moldies, the rock and roll covers album that John had expected to be quite relaxing. Phil Spector suddenly ceased showing up at all. He gave no explanation for his absence, nor any indication of when or if he would ever reappear. John made countless phone calls to Phil Spector's office, but never received a single response. Rumours swirled through the music world. Spector had either fled the city, left the country, or suffered some sort of terrible accident and was lying in hospital, possibly even dead. After several weeks of silence and uncertainty, John took matters into his own hands. He decided to take over production of the album, just as he had done with Mind Games. But when he requested the session tapes, which had been recorded in the chaos since the previous October, it was revealed that Spector had taken them home each night and still had them in his possession. By then, John and May were staying at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel and in an apartment that Ringo had. Klaus Vormann, Keith Moon and Harry Nilsson also lived there. On the evening of March 12th, John Lennon, May Pang, Harry Nilsson attended the Smothers Brothers comeback show at the Troubadour. It was a glitzy Hollywood affair with stars like Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward and Peter Lawford also in the audience. That night, John had actually discovered the cocktail the Brandy Alexander, which is a sweet cocktail of cognac, milk, creme de cacao and nutmeg, and he downed it like it was a milkshake. As the crowd waited for the curtain to rise, John, who was starting to get buzzed, started belting out "I Can't Stand the Rain." Nilsson jumped in just as loud. John had a soft spot for Tommy Smothers, but couldn't stand Dickie, and had little patience for comeback acts in general. So when the brothers finally took to the stage, John launched into a barrage of heckles aimed squarely at Dickie. Their manager stormed over, security got involved, John overturned the table, and all three, so John, Nilsson and an entirely innocent May Pang, were thrown out of the venue. But the chaos didn't end there. Outside, with cameras flashing, John wrestled a parking lot attendant to the ground, only to be disarmed by the man's look of pure admiration. He was getting wrestled by a Beatle. Two other bystanders later claimed John assaulted them, a waitress and a photographer named Brenda Parkins. When Parkins pressed charges, John settled out of court to protect his immigration status, though he insisted he'd never touched her, calling her just a pushy fan and not a real member of the press. Okay, so I was drunk, John later admitted. When Errol Flynn did it, the showbiz writers called it the golden age, Sinatra and Flynn socking it to people. I do it and I'm a bum. I was a drunk in Liverpool, smashed up phone boxes. But no one wrote about that. The next day, he and Nilsson sent flowers and a handwritten apology to the Smothers Brothers. In response, the duo released a statement suggesting it was partly our fault. That evening, a noticeably sober and remorseful John appeared alongside May Pang at an American Film Institute tribute to James Cagney, which sort of first sparked the first rumours that John had a new girl in his life. After several run-ins with hotel management, they all moved to a beach house in Santa Monica. The house actually once been owned by Bobby Kennedy. John and May made a point of sleeping in the same bed that Kennedy had done with Marilyn Monroe. Phil Spector was still nowhere to be found. So, in the meantime, John produced an album from Nilsson called Pussycats. In the first week of recording, Paul and Linda actually dropped by. Paul was flying high again thanks to the success of Band on the Run and his James Bond anthem Live and Let Die. They greeted each other as old friends, and within minutes they were jamming to Midnight Special, which was a Quarrymen favourite. Elliot Mintz accounts the final days of the lost weekend to one particular morning. He was having breakfast with John and a woman came over, handed John a napkin with a number on it and simply said, "Use it when you're ready." The next day, Elliot came to pick up John, who was actually going through one of his numerous breakups with May, and saw the same woman in the background. Mintz said, "Some people have bachelor parties, John had the lost weekend. For him, it was the end of innocence and the start of growing up and being serious. And I think on that particular morning, he recognised the obvious. He could spend a lifetime collecting phone numbers scribbled on pieces of paper. At age 34, he knew that's how it might be forever. There would be 1,000 amorous women in terry cloth robes waiting around in the morning while he assigned someone or other the task of getting rid of her." In mid-April 1974, John returned to New York for good with Harry Nilsson and checked into the Pierre Hotel on 5th Avenue, claiming the move was to finish Pussycat away from the distractions of LA. At the same time, Nilsson's label, RCA, was growing impatient. They hadn't had another hit like Without You and would consider dropping Nilsson. That's where John stepped in. He met with various RCA executives, he praised Pussycats as a masterpiece and even hinted that he might sign with the label himself and maybe even bring Ringo along too. The idea of landing not one but two ex-Beatles sent the RCA team into a frenzy. They quickly renewed Nilsson's contract, dazzled by a fantasy that in truth was never going to happen. John's immigration lawyer too, Leon Wilds, was concerned about the bad publicity that John was getting out in Los Angeles and how it would affect his case to stay in America. Wilds pushed John to get involved with charity events like One-to-One Concert, DJ'd for a station in Philadelphia during the Helping Hand Marathon, and walked with Nilsson during the March of Dimes benefit concert. John was now living in a small penthouse apartment with May on East 52nd Street overlooking the East River, which he said reminded him of the Mersey. John's apartment had a terrace from which, late one summer night, he swore he saw a UFO fly downriver and turn left over Brooklyn. He later described it in detail to a French journalist who interviewed him there, but it's also worth noting that he refers to May as his girlfriend.
Over here, up there, I saw a UFO and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turned left and then down the river. It wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't a balloon, and it was so near.
He said, "I hadn't been drinking, the God's honest truth. I only do that at weekends or when I see Harry Nilsson." East 52nd Street was the nearest that he would come to a home in the whole time of the lost weekend. Visitors included Paul McCartney, Linda McCartney and Mick Jagger. In July, Julian arrived for a visit. His mother, Cynthia, now feeling confident enough to let him stay with his father. Their new rapport continued to grow, and more so as Julian was showing signs of musical talent and had recently started guitar lessons. John showed him chords, he gave him a drum machine, and, encouraged by May, took trouble to make his stay enjoyable. But having an 11-year-old in the small apartment was sometimes jarring to a man so unused to children. Phil Spector finally handed over the tapes of John's Oldies and Moldies album sessions to a senior Capitol Records executive in exchange for $90,000. But John was in no mood to return to a project that recalled the most of his lost months in LA. The tapes as they stood, which were recorded amid drunken partying, celebrity intrusion and even gunfire, were nowhere near at a releasable standard. Besides, during his stay at the Pierre, he had begun writing material for a new album called Walls and Bridges. The lead single, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, had backup vocals by Elton John. When the track was picked for release as a single, Elton asked John to break a 2-year abstinence from live performance by appearing on stage with him if it reached number 1. John shook on the deal, but only because he felt the song could not be a hit in a million years. Despite him now living with May in an apartment, he continued to see other women. Bob Gruen said, "That fall of 74, there was one particular girl who was an art director on a magazine. I was with John one night when he was in a phone booth, calling her up and asking if he could come over, and she was rightly telling him he was too drunk. I was nervous because he was making a lot of noise, and I didn't want there to be any trouble with the police. He was not ready to be with May. He didn't want to live with her basically, but she was the one who ran his life and made all his arrangements. As he told me, I don't know how to get rid of her because she's my phone book." He maintained constant contact with Yoko and regularly snuck away to see her at the Dakota. Now they were together on the same side of the country, he no longer felt the jealousy that he'd had out west. He didn't care about Yoko seeing David Spinoza, which was her guitarist, and he urged her to find several sexual partners as a precaution against cancer. What? Final months of the Lost Weekend found him working harder than at any time since he was a Beatle. John had still not fulfilled his contract with Maurice Levy to record 3 songs of his, so he had to get his rock and roll covers album back on track, and rehearsals soon began on a farm upstate that Levy owned. And then, on November the 18th, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, his single with Elton John, reached number 1 in the United States, closely followed on the album chart by Walls and Bridges. He had promised to join Elton John on stage if this should happen, and there was to be no wriggling out of it. 2 years ago, he could have walked into an arena with anyone, but now his self-confidence was shot, and the prospect of facing a new, young, glam rock audience was terrifying. Ultimately, he kept to his word and agreed to come out at Madison Square Garden on Thanksgiving night, November the 28th, 1974. In an attempt to prepare himself, he went to Boston a few days earlier just to see Elton play, and the audience reaction actually brought on a bit of a weird deja vu. It was like Beatlemania, he would recall. I was thinking, what is this? Because I hadn't heard it since the Beatles. At the rehearsal the night before Thanksgiving, Elton wanted him to sing Imagine. John didn't want to come on and do his classic hits. They settled on Whatever Gets You Through the Night, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, because, well, Elton actually covered this for his record, and I saw her standing there. Rumours spread all over town, the show was sold out, and even Yoko and David Spinoza had tickets. Near the stage, but out of John Lennon's sightline. At the last minute, John actually nearly backed out altogether. But the years of Beatle-honed instincts kicked in, and he showed up backstage at Madison Square Garden, right on time, dressed in a plain black suit and looking like a man walking to the gallows. As the minutes ticked down to showtime, a messenger arrived with 2 small boxes, one for John and one for Elton. Inside each was a single white gardenia, carefully chosen by Yoko. The cards attached read the same: "Best of luck and all my love." "Thank goodness Yoko's not here," he said at one point, not knowing. "Otherwise, I know I'd never be able to go out there." He was slated to appear about 2/3 into the show, which meant he had to sit for an hour and a half backstage as the crowd's energy surged with each of Elton's songs. The pressure was mounting. His usual pre-show nerves hit hard, and he dashed to the bathroom to throw up. Flustered and trembling, he even forgot how to tune his guitar and had to ask Elton's guitarist, Davy Johnston, to do it for him.
And I'm sure he will be no stranger to anybody in the audience when I say it's our great privilege and your great privilege to see and hear Mr. John Lennon.
Came out and played to the crowd. Yoko said he looked lonely up on stage. The audience gave a terrific reception. John hugged Elton, and Elton seemed to be crying. John would never make another stage appearance. In his last one ever, he had never been more loved. After the show, Yoko came backstage and they sat together for a long time, talking and holding hands. May and David sat in the background, and the rest is history. The Lost Weekend was over, and John returned to Yoko until his death 5 years later. Before we go, I do want to point to an excellent documentary on Amazon Prime called Lost Weekend, A Love Story. All the information I've gathered for the video today is from YouTube, the internet, and Philip Norman's excellent book about John Lennon. But in this documentary, it paints a slightly different picture of John during these years. It tells the story of his lost weekend as a love story between him and May, and not a forced holiday from Yoko, which is the narrative that seems to dominate any article or any book that you read. See, for this video, I've decided to use as many sources as possible, so I've lent more on the dominative narrative. But for any Beatles fan or a Lennon obsessive, it's worth checking out just to see her side of the story. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Really hope you enjoyed this one. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.